I was a member of the Sullivanians from 1973 to 1979. My involvement inextricably altered my life, and this hour-and-a-half podcast tells the events of my life and chronicles my involvement and the aftermath. The collapse of the group has been documented before in several news and magazine articles, a dissertation, and most recently a book, but never a first-person accounting, and this is what you will hear on this podcast. An artist since I was a child, later earning a master's from Brooklyn College with a passion for writing poetry, the genesis of this podcast began over 10 years ago when I wrote a memoir. Years passed as I tried to shop the book, but couldn't find neither an agent nor a publisher. The book languished on my computer, and then, with the advent of iMovie, I used my memoir as the scaffolding for a documentary that became an official selection of New Filmmakers New York 2020 and a Spotlight Documentary Bronze Award winner 2020 for artistic merit. When this creative journey began, the Sullivanians were largely forgotten, except perhaps by the several hundred former members, 500 at its zenith, many of whom, like myself, survived the control wrought by the Institute and therapists that 40 years later still resonate and begs to be heard. The full documentary can be seen on my YouTube channel, Shell Fine One. Thank you. It was Thanksgiving Day, and Annie and I were going to Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Unlike the balmy weather that had carried me across the park 3 years before, the temperature this day was in the single digits. But even so, Annie and I had decided to brave the cold and were scurrying around the apartment getting dressed. "Hurry, we don't want to miss Bullwinkle," I yelled, pulling on a scratchy pair of long johns. "I'll be ready in a minute," Annie screamed back. "I'm looking for my heavy wool socks." The day's frigid cold made short drift of our multiple layers and took our breath away, and soon after Underdog had slowly drifted by, we headed downtown to Greenwich Village in search of warmth and hot chocolate. We exited at West 4th and Waverly Place, walked east, and found a small café, its windows fogged over with steam, just like the frothy cappuccino we were seeking. The cinnamon-laced air was a clear indication that we'd chosen well, and we sat at a round marble table near the window to people-watch and began the task of undressing. "With all this Morse tea, I feel like I'm going to spawn," I said, removing my last sweater. We ordered, and after a few minutes of silence, I said to Annie, "It must have been grotesque to see your mother at the party on Saturday night." "It's always creepy. I thought I was over her being around, but I guess I'm not. It's not knowing whether she's going to show up at a party or not that's the problem." "So I've always wondered, why did you come back to Sullivanian therapy?" I'd thought this after hearing Annie's history. "I think it would be the last place you'd want to be." "I wanted to go to school in New York, and I'd heard about the trainee program and thought it sounded very exciting. I believe in Lewin and Getty's theories, and I believe we are the vanguard party. I try to tune my mother out. Unfortunately, I don't always succeed." Annie was nervously folding a paper napkin, twisting the bottom into what looked like the stem of a flower. "I never saw Ron for therapy again, but he did refer me to Beverly, and for that I'm grateful. She told me about Aunt Lainey looking for roommates, and I guess you know the rest." After the waiter brought our hot chocolate, I slipped the flask from my jacket and poured some of the amber liquid through the creamy folds of whipped cream. Drink up. It'll warm you up and take the bitter taste of your mother away." "Impossible," Annie said. "Well, now that you asked," I said with some irony, So sorry. I'll snap out of whatever this is. What did you want to say? Annie responded. For me, Thanksgiving is hard enough day, but this year, with my mother's death, I'm having a doubly hard time. I just can't wrap my head around it. Honestly, it's difficult for me to relate to that, Annie said. My mother is alive, but I wish she wasn't here. I get that. Do you ever think about not being in the group? No, Annie answered without hesitation. I believe what I said about us being the vanguard party, and we are going to help shape the future. I think Seth is a visionary. And what about the future? Do you think about having children? Not really. My mother hasn't been the greatest role model. I took note of Annie's fanatical devotion to the group, remembering her attitude toward Serena's individualism, and tucked it away. But I think that was when I began to distrust her, just a little. On that day, I thought of Maria as an older sister, and Annie as the youngest, and I loved her. On that day, it would have been impossible for me to imagine Annie as my nemesis and perpetrator of my expulsion from the group. Word finally got out that Seth had been slowly disbanding the original trainee program because the Institute had come under scrutiny by the New York State Office of Mental Health. Going forward, new trainees had to have, at the very least, a college degree. Seth's conspiracy theories and paranoia intensified, and the therapist reinforced the importance of safeguarding the Institute and the trainee program in each session. I continued to abide for a while. College and graduate school are times to build future alliances, but I made few friends at school or work because those relationships were tainted with distrust. What if word got out about the group to the wrong people? Debbie eventually left the Institute too. As she'd been both Maria and my therapist, we were both upset, but for different reasons. Debbie had been Maria's therapist for the 5 years she'd been in the group. She was leaving for Sierra Leone soon and didn't want to change therapists before she left. And as for me, this would be my 4th therapist in less than 3 years. Annie was the lucky one. Beverly had a college degree. Annie was the only one home in the apartment after I was given the news. She was at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks when I blasted in announcing the news. I'm so angry I could put my fist through the wall, I said. You're hysterical, Annie responded, looking up. Listen, I have finals coming up, and I can't deal with this right now. I'm getting moved around like a relative nobody wants, I said, ignoring her. Taking a moment, she asked, So, who were you referred to? Fucking Stan Arnold. He's a history teacher, for God's sake. When did he become a trainee? What does he know about being a therapist? He looks like a fucking corpse. Try and calm down, honey. I know it's upsetting. But he must have something. They wouldn't have asked him. Besides, it doesn't really matter who we're in therapy with, as long as we continue. Oh, for a second, I thought you were showing some sympathy, Annie. But here comes the party line. Do you truly believe that it doesn't matter who we see? I think the connection with our therapist is important. Wouldn't you be upset if Beverly left? Sure, but I'd go on just like you should. My stomach ached, and I suddenly began to cry. Embarrassed, I turned away. It's stupid and irrational, I know, but Debbie was my therapist when my mother died, and I still feel guilty I didn't go to the funeral. Annie finally walked to my side and put her arms around my shoulders. And then we heard the front door slam. I bet that's Maria, I said, looking up. She had the session after mine. Debbie's been her therapist since she got here. A moment later, Maria walked into the kitchen. Her eyes were red and her expression told it all. She'd been referred to Stan Arnold, too. You know, this just makes leaving for Sierra Leone so much easier, she said, pouring herself a drink. A few months later, it was rumored that Debbie had left the institute because she couldn't function as a therapist anymore and had had a psychotic break. Teams of men from the group were supposedly sent out to find her, and they did, on the street, soliciting, and she was placed in psychiatric care. If I picture my time in the group as a bell curve, with my mother's death at the apex, it was my referral to Stan Arnold, a man I didn't respect, as the push towards the downward slope. I was 25 when my mother died. I never had the opportunity to develop an adult relationship with her, one where I could hold different ideas but still love her. Instead, the Sullivanians reinforced her perceived Medusa-like power over me. One look and I'd be turned to stone, and panic would walk across my chest like a cat each time I thought of her, even after death. I waited 3 weeks to call, but in the end I succumbed. I wasn't ready to leave the Sullivanians, but my contempt for Stan continued unabated. There was his bald head, his parchment paper skin, and his array of polyester short-sleeve shirts, pistachio green, dentist blue, and anemic yellow, all with the 2 middle buttons inevitably undone. In the session, as he continued talking, he was unaware that his words were drowning in a murky pool surrounding him. I separated my physical self, which continued to nod as he spoke, from my magical self, much as I had done as a child, and flew from his dark basement room to circle the stars. In June 1976, I graduated from college, and that fall I would begin the MFA evening program at Brooklyn College. I'd found a great waitress job working the lunch shift at the Bull and Bear on Rector Street. The tips alone would pay for my summer share in Amagansett, not to mention the additional money from my long-time cleaning jobs. But as I was racing back to the apartment to share the news, I took a wide berth around a passing taxi and misstepped, slipping off my high-wedged corkies. I'd heard a snap, like the crack of a wishbone, and crumpled to the ground. I'd broken the 5th metatarsal of my right foot. I stayed in Amagansett for the summer, but I had to rely on others to get around, and since the summer was all about partying, I was shunted to the sidelines. When school started, I was still hobbling around on crutches. I'd lost the waitress job, and when Stan told me I'd sabotaged the job to comply with my mother's jealousy and belief I couldn't be self-sufficient, the words rang hollow. He suggested I call around and borrow money in advance of my student loans, a common practice in the group. But even that would only stretch so far, and I would eventually have to pay the money back. I desperately needed a job. The orthopedist had vetoed cleaning and waitressing, and since the MF program was in the evening, all that was left was an office job. In one interview after another, I was told either you're overqualified or underqualified. And then I came across the ad for Reliable List Incorporated, the best in direct mail. I was employed as an account assistant and instructed not to mention my $160 a week's income to any of the other 15 assistants. We were merely glorified clerks who never directly interacted with the clients. The account executive's role was to oversee us, laborious tasks we completed for them from inside their glass-enclosed offices. The intense scrutiny by the sales managers was only made bearable by the camaraderie among the young assistants. We were drones in a glass hive, and I gradually began to realize this paralleled my function in the group. When Ken Rosenzweig, one of the assistants, invited me to lunch, I accepted, hoping it wasn't an overture to a real date. But I soon found out the real reason. I'm a member of District 65, a union that represents clerical workers, he explained, and I've been asking the account assistants to sign this card. And then he slid a white index card face down across the tabletop. I picked it up and began to read the fine print. I can summarize it for you, he said. In a nutshell, it says you want to be represented at Reliable by the union. Among other things, it will give us the power to bargain and set up a salary and promotional schedule. The reason I asked you to lunch is because we're not permitted to recruit on the premises, except during breaks. We're keeping it under wraps until a majority have signed. You were told by management not to share your salary. Am I right? He continued. We all were, but that's to polarize us. Listen, I make $110, and I know Diane makes $140. Think about it. Do you see any legitimate reason for keeping your salary a secret other than creating suspicion between us? I make $160, I immediately responded. You're right. We all do the same shit work. He laughed at that. Right. We all have the same responsibilities. You shouldn't work for less. None of us should. The union would ask for uniform salaries. He wasn't the baby-faced kid he appeared to be, with dark brown hair, intelligent eyes, and cheeks smoother than mine. I was intrigued, but ignorant. My first thought was that the union was illegal, but this was the one area where Stan proved himself to be invaluable. His knowledge of labor history was impressive. He explained how unions had formed the United States democracy. He was in his element and urged me to sign, and to my surprise, I became involved with the union meetings, recruitment, and strategy planning. Unfortunately, Stan hadn't been prescient enough to realize that a conflict might arise between my loyalty to the group and my newfound interest in the union. I soon learned that there were only 4 valid, rigorously enforced reasons for an account assistant to get up from their desk during the workday. The first was checking on a list availability. Then there was the allotted 10-minute break at 3 o'clock, going to the bathroom, and finally getting coffee. And at Reliable Lists, its employees were supplied with unlimited amounts of free coffee. Maria Elena left for Sierra Leone in early March. It was still bitterly cold, and Sandra and I stood in the wind-battered airline terminal with Maria and her other friends, icicles hanging from our air-tipped words. Annie had fought with Maria for weeks before her departure. Parastatic rages of feeling abandoned, her therapist had said, and Annie wouldn't come to the airport. When they finally announced her flight, Maria took off her heavy blue coat and handed it to me. Keep warm. We hugged, and she whispered, I love you, Cora. I think I'm going to miss you most of all. Then louder, she said to everyone else, please write, please write. After quick hugs all around, she was gone, like a genie summoned back into the bottle.